Welcome to the Inner West Library Australian Music Month Speaker Series. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today, our conversation will be with Nic Dalton. Nic moved from Canberra with his band The Plunderers from Canberra to the Inner West in the mid-80s and started the record label Half a Cow in 1990, releasing both local and international bands to this day. He has released music and played in bands such as Godstar, Sneeze, the Lemonheads, and Nic Dalton and his Gloom Chasers. He has played at local venues such as the Annandale, the Sando, and others. Welcome, Nic.
Hi, Dennis.
As a performing musician, what were your favourite venues to play, and what were your favourite venues to go to as a punter in the Inner West?
I suppose I first started out playing at the Sandringham Hotel in 1984 with cover band The Gadflies. Continued to play there over the years until it closed with many different bands. So the Sando was always a nice place to play. And I'd say the Annandale, when that started up as a venue, even though it was a bit further up the road and out of the way from what we were used to, it really liked the Annandale. Max's Petersham, Sydney Uni, Petersham Bowling Club, Gasoline Pony, and Midnight Special. With the Plunderers, we sort of were like a weekend band. We were sort of quite popular, so we'd play weekends. And then my next main band was Sneeze, and we would play those same venues, but we only really played weekday nights and afternoons. So they were two very different bands, but at the same venues.
Were you able to make a living off that?
Not really. Well, I mean, I suppose we always had jobs in the Plunderers. We would play 3 or 4 times a week in the sort of late 80s.
There were enough venues and
Yeah,
enough
yeah,
audience back then.
yeah. Sort of didn't really go professional, like needing another job until I joined the Lemonheads, and that was only for a couple of years of having like a proper wage like that.
Hmm. Your label focuses on local bands and is well known in the Inner West. What made you start the label and why in the Inner West?
I just wanted to release an album of some 4 tracks that I'd done with my girlfriend at the time, Robin from the Hummingbirds, an album called Love Positions, and that was sort of like the main impetus behind the label, but just sort of grew to having other local bands and friends bands. There's a band called the Craven Fops who I really liked, and Miles Ferguson who started Half a Cow with me. He liked them as well, so we put out a Craven Fops 10 inch, and that was actually the first release. And then over the years, the early days were sort of bands were made up of friends of mine and friends of friends, and it was all very close knit, and everyone was sort of living in the Inner West, except for Swirl. They lived over up in Avalon. It was all pretty low key.
So you didn't do A&R or anything like that per se. It was just more mates whose music you liked.
Yeah, at the beginning, and then when the internet came along, you'd get email requests to put people out, so it sort of changed a lot over the years.
You grew up in Canberra. How'd you end up in the Inner West?
First place I lived in was in King's Cross on Macleay Street, and that was sort of pretty wild over there. And then Surrey Hills, and then friends of ours were in a band called the Tall Shirts, and they two of them lived in Annandale, and we went to a party there one night. We sort of walked over the hill from Glebe, and there was this really nice suburb. It was like an old country town with wide streets, and just really loved Annandale, and lived there in 3 different houses from like 1988 through to about 1997.
Yeah, wow.
Just a nice suburb, and it wasn't even the Inner West, and it was sort of like West. People call it the Western suburbs. Over the hill from Glebe.
Glebe was considered city.
Well, I suppose it was. I mean, yeah. Well, Glebe was like Newtown, really. It was sort of just both outside of the city.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. But Annandale was great because I could walk to work, which was in Glebe Point Road. My best mate Tom lived in Annandale, and Robin and Simon from the Hummingbirds lived there. It was close to the city in Newtown. You could walk to Newtown across Parramatta Road. It was close to the Annandale. It was also close to Max's and Leichhardt Shopping Mall, and yeah, it was a nice suburb, close to everything.
Was this all share houses or?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Share houses, and it hadn't been gentrified then. It was the Annandale shops was like a real little country town. I always remember it was sort of quaint.
Closed on Sundays?
Yeah, pretty much.
It seems you have a bit of a connection with Annandale, writing songs about it as well, like Annandale 2038 Lula.
Yeah.
So besides the country town aspect of it and the locality, was there a vibe that you liked about it?
Not really, because it was just a suburb. Just after living in Surrey Hills and that sort of side of it, it just seemed like fresh air. It just seemed a lot different.
more the people than the place.
Yeah, yeah, and it just seemed to be where a lot of people suddenly moved, and like Stevie Plunder, he was living in Newtown, so it was pretty close. And I didn't have a car, so I would either borrow Robin's car or we'd get taxis or walk everywhere, or maybe get buses. But it was mainly walking because the distance between Newtown and Annandale isn't actually that far. It seems like it's got this big barrier called Parramatta Road running through it, but once you cross the road, you're in Stanmore and then you're in Newtown. It's nice to walk around, and over the years, I love walking around because I would write lots of songs as I walk around, and there's certain songs I would only ever pick up if I walk down that certain street, what I'd call my own personal song lines. So yeah, I still love walking around writing songs.
It's an interesting concept that you just mentioned of song lines there. Could you expand on that a little more?
I would notice a certain song which I still haven't finished because I stopped walking that route. It wasn't so much the inner west, but it was from Central to the Strawberry Hills post office, and I would just always pick up on this song. It would just come back into my head, and I would just add another line or keep working on it. Lots of songs I would write walking from the Half a Cow Bookshop in Glebe back to my home in Annandale. I would love that walk past the old Camperdown Children's Hospital and through the little park, Scary Lane behind there, and yeah, and I just so yeah, I call them songlines because I read the Bruce Chatwin book Songlines, and he's talking about the Aborigines have their songlines, and I thought, oh, that's sort of it's sort of like you have these little points, these little geographical points along the way that just trigger things, and yeah, that I call them my own songlines. I suppose it's different to other songlines, but
No, it's a great idea that those songs are just out there and you need to be on that wavelength at
yeah,
that time to pick it up.
yeah. There's a song I wrote about 7 years ago called "The Scary Lane," and it's all about Tom and I and some other friends walking from Annandale via Tom's house in Camperdown and making our way to the Lansdowne to see some bands, and then all heading back home again, and dropping each one off at their own house, and that's definitely like about Annandale. I don't have that many songs about suburbs, but I do like to yeah, drop Australian names in and suburbs in and streets in
Hmm.
after years of just having Galveston and Hollywood, all the American names. It's good to have Australian names and things.
Well, what was one of your most memorable gigs and why? What happened at it?
Yeah, well, I really had to think about this because there's been a few, but one in particular was at the Annandale in 2001, and my band Sneeze, we launched our Lost the Spirit to Rock and Roll album, and there was we had like an 8 piece on stage because it was a record launch. We sort of made it a really big affair, and we had the venue was packed. That's memorable because Sneeze was only ever really playing these sort of like I said before, Tuesday and Wednesday night shows, or a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday afternoon, and we never supported other bands really, so we never really knew if we were like that popular because we would only have 20, 30 people at our gigs. But this launch for the Lost of Spirit album was just fantastic. I really felt we were really succeeding, even though it wasn't to be. Like we never really got to be very popular, but I hadn't experienced that sort of crowd since the Plunderers. I'm talking about my own music, of course, not other bands have been in.
Hmm.
It was a really good night to have a really like big crowd that had all come along and think, oh well, people actually like us.
A bit of vindication.
Yeah.
So you've been creating in the inner west for a large part of your life. What stands out about like the Annandale or Max's or the Sando compared to say the Hoey or Fishers?
I suppose well, like you're getting back to the Sandringham, like there's quite a long history where when I first started playing there with the Gadflies, I'd replaced their previous bass player Elmo, and he had a bit of a following, and so I was sort of hated by some of the fans, and Warren, the owner, he didn't like me because I was a bit of a cheeky upstart. Then over the years, like I played there with the Plunderers and with Sneeze, and then came time where I moved my Half a Cow office upstairs above the Sando because we needed an office space because the bookshop had shut down in Glebe, so yeah, we needed office space. So Dave Chatfield and I, my label manager, we had offices up there, and then the Sando was sold, and the new owners bought the Sando, and they said we could stay there, and so we were in above the Sando for 9 months, and they stopped charging us rent, and we just waited till they finally said, "Oh, I think you guys should move out." And it was quite odd. Like the Sando was shut while they were renovating, and we had our own key to get in, and I had a drum kit set up in my office, so we did lots of recording there. And then the new owner's sister moved in to the flat out the back, and we thought, this is so weird. We could hear her and her husband arguing all the time, and so when they finally said, "Oh, you guys should move out," we said, "Okay, we will." We were just waiting for you guys to tell us, and so that was quite odd to still be there for like 9 months in between. And then when it reopened up as another venue, I didn't really have much to do that. But then before it turned into
Holy moly.
a little golf thing, I was back there DJing on Friday nights when it was the Northcote Social Club,
Hmm.
and that was fantastic because I was getting to play just whatever I wanted rather than having to play 70s disco or strictly 60s. And the bar staff really liked me. That when that closed down, I was the sort of the final DJ, so I thought, oh, they must have liked what I was doing. So yeah, I had a good relationship with the Sando, although I never was really one of the Sando barflies. Like I didn't tend to go and meet there for friends for drinks there. I was more of an Annandale
Hmm.
or Lansdowne sort of person. I had a few locals over the years, and Annandale would have been my main local because I was in walking distance from the three places I used to live at.
Who or what are your favourite inner west bands from that 90s era and now?
Well, yeah, this is an interesting question because it's hard to know where people actually live. There could have been a band who I really like, and they could have been from Lithgow.
Hmm.
But yeah, I suppose the Moles. They used to play at the Sandringham a lot. I really like the Moles, and back in the late '80s, Died Pretty and the New Christ were favourites of mine, and Rob Younger, the singer from the New Cross, he lived in Forest Lodge. And then the Hummingbirds, I used to go and see because they were obviously friends of mine.
Hmm.
But more recently, a band called the Ramalamas has been one of my favourite local bands, and a younger band called the S Bends I really like.
Are these bands that you would put on at Petersham Bolo, or?
Yeah, I don't sort of hunt out bands to play at the bolo. I just put the bands on the email, the bolo. I try and give everyone a go, and also because I have a record label, I try and really sort of stay away from putting on half a cow bands, which is a bit unfair to the bands, but I really have been pretty clear about that. Not to If the half a cow band wants to play, I try and give them a gig, but I don't give them any special treatment, unfortunately.
Hmm.
Yeah,
You're not given any free passes there.
not really. Yeah, it wouldn't be right.
It must be a shame though, because you obviously love their music and you want to see them do well.
Yeah, true, but they probably do well, at another venue and have a good night. Yeah, and I can go along without the pressure of thinking, oh, there's no one here, or they're too loud, or
Hmm.
one of them chucked up.
You mentioned too loud. It's been the bane of many live venue music.
Oh, yeah, and it's usually just one person that lives behind the venue that moved in, recently. It's such a shame, but yeah, it's just city living, too many people.
Raves and techno were really big in the 90s, and Half a Cow was known for guitars and bands rather than dance music per se. Were you drawn to any other genres, and how did quote unquote indie rock sit in the overall scene in Sydney, in your opinion?
Yeah, I remember feeling like really outdated if I go, oh, you still, you're playing rock and roll, like run into old school friends and they go, are you still playing that rock and roll stuff? It's all about dance music and all that. So, I mean, I love all sorts of music, but there was one day there was a big rave on it. I think it was Manning Bar or somewhere, and Freaky Loops it was called. And I went along, and I was down the front. I got home at 6 in the morning. I had a great time, and I thought, oh, like I can see, why people loved it, and so I embraced it as well. And like I say, I like all music, and there was a duo from Canberra called Biff Tech,
Hmm.
Kate and Nicole, and I liked them, and we were going to work on a soundtrack together for Somersault, the movie, but then I got sick, and that didn't happen. So it was a shame because I was looking forward to doing some music with people who made like electronic music. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm known for rock and pop and folk rock and all that, but yeah, like I wasn't a really big fan of the techno stuff, but I was sort of all for it. Like it's good to have all sorts of music. It's interesting. It was Rat Cat that came along and sort of broke that sort of spell that there were local bands that could do really well on the charts with with playing guitar music.
Hmm.
So it wasn't all lost ultimately.
In your opinion, was that scene that Rat Cat started spearheaded, or was the first to be acknowledged from? Was it underground? Was it mainstream? Did it become mainstream? What made that so?
I was definitely from more of an underground or independent scene, and I always have been, even though I've played in sort of bigger bands, and the Half a Cow label was involved with some bigger labels over the record companies over the years. And but I think with the mainstream to me always means like mainstream equals charts, the record charts, and also commercial radio, whereas underground would mean the local record stores and community radio, and they were pretty different until Hummingbirds and Rat Cat and Falling Joys and Clouds all started having some success on the mainstream, plus other bands, but they were the bands that I personally knew. Whereas my band, the Plunderers, we never got that break. We never got asked. We never got signed up by a bigger label, and we always thought, oh, why we left that? But we just didn't have maybe the nice shirt or something.
Did Triple J going national have play a part in that?
Oh, definitely, because they had to sort of make everything a bit wider, and yeah, I remember that because Triple J was like when it was just Sydney, you'd hear Died Pretty on the radio a lot more, and you'd hear X, and you'd hear a lot of the local bands. And then when it went national, they had to sort of play a bit of everything, and then it just really changed, and sort of they'd become too broad and trying to please too many people.
Hmm.
Yeah, like the mainstream suddenly, like after Nirvana became big, the mainstream was suddenly full of all the bands that were deemed as like the indie bands before that, like all the labels like Red Eye and Waterfront and Half a Cow. We all got sort of snapped up by the majors, and they tore us all apart.
Just money thrown at you.
Yeah, and it's yeah, it was quite full on actually.
When bands made it big and left the Sydney scene or the inner west scene, what was the vibe after that? Like after, you mentioned before that you went on tour for like 2 years and then came back. Was it a gigantic sea change when you come back? Was it still about friends having fun, or like was it something else now?
Yeah, well, getting to the first part, like bands made it big. They didn't really leave the Sydney scene. Like you'd still see like all the bands I knew were still all sort of in Sydney. It's like no one really left. Just everyone was always touring. I suppose your weekends you wouldn't really see all the same friends because suddenly everyone was off playing Melbourne or Brisbane or touring overseas. So I don't think the vibe really changed. I don't know. Some bands just became a bit more well known, and that, but I don't think it really changed the people in the bands. I think they were still the same sort of people. But my own band, the Plunderers, we sort of felt like we were left behind, and I noticed when Rat Cat became big, even though I'd known Simon since 1986, I was playing in the Hummingbirds, and we did a show with them in Wollongong, and my sister had given me a Rat Cat CD for them to sign, and I was really nervous going into their dressing room, even though they're friends of mine. So because I'd never known anyone, I'd never had a friend who was like number one on the charts before, and I thought, oh, is Simon going to remember me? Is he going to be different? And it's like, we laugh at that now because I've told him that story just recently, and but you just don't know what it's like when you meet someone, and if they become a big pop star, it's like you think, oh, they've really changed. Because the same thing happened to me when I came back from the Lemonheads. People thought I was this, up myself and wouldn't talk to them. And I remember I was at a music industry party, and I was playing pool with Ray from the Hard-Ons, and he turned and said to me, "Oh, you're actually okay." And I thought, what do you mean? He goes, "Oh, I thought you'd be a real dickhead." And I go, "No, I'm still me, because I knew him before." It's like I hadn't changed at all. Because when I did leave the Lemonheads, half the reason I wanted to leave was just to come back and keep doing my thing and catch the 433 back to work. I remember saying that, or the 370. I remember saying I just want to get the bus back to work, and because I didn't feel I'd changed at all. But obviously you do, because you don't have to worry about certain things, but then you have more worries.
Yeah. Well, you just grow as a person, right? 2 years isn't a short amount of time.
No, but it's like big changes happen. Like I broke up with my girlfriend, and when I came back to try and start playing music with my friends, I'd go around to their house, and they were just sitting around playing video games with their new friends, and I'd be sitting in the corner, nothing to do, and sort of being ignored. And I just say, oh, I better just go home again now.
So, as I just mentioned, you did tour overseas. Oh, I guess you kind of answered this question. You toured overseas for a few years with various groups. Like, how did you adjust when you returned? Like, I guess the scene didn't necessarily greet you with open arms.
Yeah, I suppose Well, it did in a way because I suppose some friends were happy to have me back, and I was able to sort of help run the label again, and realise that the bookshop was a big mess. And but but the worst thing was, like the record label did a deal with a major record company, and that was a big mistake looking back, because they signed up Half a Cow, which had 6 or 7 bands, and you can't make 6 or 7 bands all successful. So there was a lot of money spent, and each of the bands wanted to be be top of the charts, and it's just impossible. And it's like I suddenly found myself sitting in an office in Alexandria, and thinking, what am I doing here? And a cleaner would come in at 6 o'clock and empty my bin, and I just thought, this isn't my world. So after a couple of years of that, we sort of went back to being totally 100% independent, which is sort of where I belong, because there's just too much pressure to try and sell record. You've got to just too much money needed to be spent on promotion and videos and all that sort of stuff.
I say like a band like Sidewinder, for example.
Yeah, well, there's a story there. Like, yeah, Sidewinder was touted to be the next big thing, and it just didn't work, and so it all fell apart. And then Polygram moved on to the next band, which was Powderfinger, and the Powderfinger were happy to play the game, whereas Sidewinder just a little bit rebellious,
Hmm.
didn't want to get up and early and do the radio interviews, that sort of thing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's not just they didn't have that one thing that just made radio go yes.
No, I think they did, and radio was paying them. I just think that the Mercury Records, had to deal with Half a Cow, they once they saw that Sidewinder were going to do really well, they sort of ousted out the Half a Cow aspect of it, and they didn't realise that they needed us there to help liaison with the band to get things done, and that's why it all fell apart. Well, one of the reasons.
Hmm.
That's what I believe. They sort of said, "Oh, we don't need you and Dave anymore, and we'll wake them up to go to the interview." And I said, "Okay, well, good luck."
That's all my questions, Nick. Is there anything that you haven't been asked that you'd like to be asked?
Everyone always complains that music is the venues aren't the same anymore, and it's there aren't the people doing it anymore. And I think ever since I started booking the bands at the Petersham Bowling Club, I've noticed that there is healthy scene. There's lots of bands, young and old, still playing. Like all the old bands are still out there getting gigs, and all the young bands are getting gigs. And there's a lot of, like, I suppose, warehouse party sort of things. And there might not be the same venues as before, but I still think for the people that want to go out and see music, there's still plenty of options. Like along Enmore Road and Marrickville.
Like the former Green Room, for example.
Yeah, yeah. And the Midnight Special and Gasoline Pony and the Great Club, although I haven't been there. I think, things change. I mean, when I started playing, we could play 3 or 4 times a week and in all sorts of parts of Sydney. But I look back at the bands in the 60s and the 70s, and they could play 3 or 4 gigs in a night in the 60s, and you'd get a guy who'd be carrying his drum kit around on a little trailer he'd built on the back of his push bike. And you know, I think it was, there's always been music, but I think the heyday was even before my time, and I think people shouldn't really complain about things, because we're lucky, privileged in this country to, if you want to do this sort of thing, you can,
Hmm.
compared to other places.
I mean, especially with somewhere like the Bowler, like you said, where all you have to do is email the booker and they'll try and find a spot for you. It's not that you're not cool enough to play there or anything like that.
Yeah, it's funny, like booking a venue, because that's like being the enemy. It's like one of those things. It's just like the enemy of the musician is the booker, is the manager, is the music journalist. And so when I became the booker, I thought, oh my God, this is the worst job ever. They were going to hate me. So I really try and I reply to everybody, even if it's with sorry, there's no date for you. But I try and give everyone a gig, whether it's a metal band or a Christian choir. I try and slot them in, and the board at the Bolo are really keen to really push young bands that might not get gigs anywhere else because they haven't got anything released, and that really like pleases me, because I started the Half a Cow record label to help young bands. I love being involved with bands' first recordings before they move on to something bigger, and so there the Bolo sort of suits me, whereas I just try and give everyone a go. There's been a lot of electronic stuff on there recently, and I'm not really a big fan of electronic stuff, but word must have gotten around that, oh, the Bolo's giving us gigs, no one else will, and so that's helping them out.
It must be hard, I imagine. Like, would you put the metal band and the choir on the same bill?
No, no, they definitely would be different times of the day.
Oh, thanks for your time, Nick. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis.
Thank you for listening, and look out for upcoming digital content through the Inner West Library's What's On and social media channels.